Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1406. So let's sum up what we've been learning and contextualizing it as well. So the story of Ayin Beis is the story of interface. The interface between the divine and existence. That we begin step by step, but we as human beings with independent consciousness, independent identities, slowly assimilate and integrate a higher consciousness, a higher reality called the divine into our beings, to the point that we merge in the fullest possible way. But that takes many steps, because for us to maintain our individuality and independence while also absorbing the godliness requires that we have the right containers and all the proper tools to be able to maintain that type of intensity. And hence we have all the different stepping stones throughout what we call the cosmic order, Seder Ishtalshelus, to climb this ladder, to travel on this journey. In general, as the Rebbe Rashab has explained in Ayin Beis, which is really I don't want to say compendium, but it's definitely a comprehensive, looking for the right word, a comprehensive taking all the ideas of Chassidus and putting them into one flow. So in Ayin Beis, he focuses on two main ways of how this is done, or two ways. This interface can be done from the bottom up, which is primarily what we call tefillah, prayer, where we reach out through our needs and our feelings, our longings for transcendence from the bottom up, that we are elevating the divine as it's within us to reach a level of Remem was Keser, which is a state of higher transcendence, or Mamayla Lamata from the top down, which is primarily through Torah. God gave us Torah, Ata Haresa Ladas. The first is V'yadaita Hayayim, you shall know today, Vashavesa Levavecha, and shall internalize it in your heart. And that was over 550 pages were dedicated to that, and that concluded that section on page 1350. Aleph Shinun. Aleph Shinun on 1350 in this volume began now which is the Ata Reis Ladas through Torah. Torah is a gift that God gives us, which is a blueprint of existence, as well as a reflection of God's mind and God's will. And there, the Torah, which also includes our effort in learning Torah, in understanding it, like he said, also Mamat Lamaila in Torah itself, because we need to work on it. Like he explained on the top page 1404, he said explicitly that there's also Torah Mamat Lamaila. And that's through our work down below, through studying Torah and looking to it for guidance. And ultimately, the Torah helps us create the interface from the top down. So it's almost like God giving us a snapshot of how he sees it. And from the bottom up is how we experience it from the bottom up. But you really want to have the joining of the two. That's very brief. Where we are here is in the middle of the discussion of what Torah does. But when we go into this topic, we suddenly hit another issue that needs to be addressed. Torah alone can give you the picture, but you need to have the neshamas that come into this world that actualize it. Torah is, at the end of the day, I don't want to call it a book, but it is, at the end of the day, doesn't have the power to transform the world on its own. It needs arms and legs. It needs, and God needs ambassadors. He needs someone that's going to actualize the Torah in this world. And that's how the neshamas that come into this world. And hence we have this interesting interaction between the Neshamas and Torah. And the question is, which is higher than which? Sometimes it seems that Torah is higher, sometimes it seems the Neshamas is higher. So he explained that both are true. It depends which level of soul you're talking about. If you're talking the root of the soul and it originates in its source, so then it's higher than Torah. If you're talking about the soul as it comes down into this world where it's concealed and it needs support, it needs light to illuminate the dark paths of this world, so it needs Torah, so then Torah is higher. So in essence, the Neshamas are definitely higher. But there are levels where the Torahs are, and we turn to Torah, and that's why the Zohar says that we bind ourselves to Torah, and Torah binds us to God. That's the initial level. Then we come to another level, when the Neshamas are higher than Torah. And that's a learning Torah, not for us to connect to God, but here we're connecting God to Torah, we're revealing higher levels of the divine within Torah. And that's why Neshamas have the power, as he said earlier, to go beyond Torah. That's why they can change things, whether it's temporarily, but they have the power to go beyond Torah, as we learned earlier, and we'll soon get back to that as well. So now the Neshamas are bringing down, like it said about David, that David was mechaber, it says, the words he used was these words, that David, I'm going to use the exact words, mechaber Torah shalamayla b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in that sense, the Neshamas have a root that's even higher than Torah. And he explained it with the Zohar. Istako baraisa bara alma. God looks into the Torah and creates the world. So the Torah is a blueprint for existence, like a snapshot, what he called the level of Ak, Adam Kadman. Specifically the outer dimension of Ak. Then it says Barnash, the person, which is the Neshama, looks into Torah and Kayim Alma, and sustains the world. So he explains that the first part of the statement is God's creating the Torah as a blueprint. The Torah is serving as a blueprint, as a snapshot, a picture of all of existence. And Kudsha Brichu is a higher level than Torah and higher than Ak. So Kudsha Brichu is Taka Baraisa. God looks into the Torah. In order for there to be existence, the Torah serves as that interface in order to create existence. Then comes Neshamas Yisrael, which are even higher than Torah. They are rooted in the place of Kudsha Brichu, in the Atzmis, what he called like Pnimius of Ak, which is higher than Torah, and they have the power to Mamshech Atzmis Ein Sof, that's higher than Torah, and even higher than the snapshot, than the Kloli, than the all-encompassing energy or light, and to draw that into Torah. So now, in the context of the interface that I spoke about, though he didn't say it specifically, it's clear that even when you have the two approaches, from the bottom up and from the top down, the Neshamas down below play a tremendous role. First of all, we implement the Torah, and then, yes, we're looking to Torah as our guide, as like the light that illuminates the darkness so the eyes can see. But there's something more. Neshamas, as they climb, they have the power to go back to the highest levels and draw that into Torah. So even the Mamai Lamata of Torah benefits from the souls because the souls are even higher. Now, is that like the level of the souls working from the bottom up, and the bottom up has the power to reach the Helam Atzmi, which is higher than Eir? I would say yes, even though he hasn't said it explicitly, but I just wanted to state that that's very possible that ultimately that's how it works. So first, you think bottom up is more integrated, but you don't reach the highest levels. Torah brings down the highest levels downwards. But then there's some place where the Neshamas that are rooted even higher than Torah would mean that there's like a level where the bottom up and the top down join, and that's even higher than Torah, because Torah is only the top down. And that's where the Neshamas contribute in a sense, and that's where you have the combination of both virtues. But we're going to talk about that more later. I'm just pointing it out in the whole context of things here. Yeah. So then the next piece, which we learned on Friday, let's sum up. So I'm now summing up the top of page 1406. Since we also had some connection problems, hopefully everything will be smooth now. So if anything was missed, I'll review it now. Va'inyanhu, and I'm just summing up on line 2 on page 1406. So now the Rebbe Rashab is dissecting the anatomy of what a neshama is. So he brings the Eitz Chaim. This is a very classic and fundamental Eitz Chaim, which really explains what we always refer to, the Yechida of the neshama, the Yechida Shabanefesh. We know the soul has 5 levels: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. But that's in general. But what does it mean specifically? We even know that we talk about Neshama Shenesata B'Tahirihi. That's the level of Atzilus and Ak, and even before the Tzimtzum, the highest level of the soul. Did he refer to it as Yechida on page 1404? No. But he did refer to Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama being as the soul comes down into the body. Okay, 1 second. Yeah. So Nefesh Ruach Neshama is that Neshama comes down into Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. Chaya is usually associated with Atzilus, and Yechida with higher than Atzilus. But now he brings the Eitz Chaim. So let's read. What does he say in Eitz Chaim? I'm going to read it inside again. It says like this: Shar Memal of Peri Gimel. She says Sheyesh Nitzutz Koten Ma'oid. There's a very tiny spark. Shubchinas Alakus. So it begins with a spark that's purely divine. Where is it coming from? It comes from Nimshach Madrega Achrena Shebebeira, from the lowest level of the Creator. Now, I explained lowest here doesn't mean lowest because in the Creator there's no higher, low, but it means it's just a minimal aspect. It doesn't reflect the whole etzem of the Beira of the Creator. So it's considered the lowest as the lowest level of expression. Now, what happens with this spark? So this tiny spark, which is, think of it like if the Beira, the Creator, is a large flame, this is a tiny spark from that flame. Obviously, Creator is even beyond being a flame, but I'm just using it to visualize an example. Now, what happens with this spark? We don't yet have a neshama yet. So he says, this spark, v'zeh hanitzutz, says the Eitz Chaim, mislabeshes b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra. It manifests b'koyach nitzutz echad. The koyach is a word that it was always not so clear what it means by what he means by that. But for practical purposes, we'll translate it as in the power of one spark that's not Beira, it's Nivra. So the spark from the large flame of the Creator is now manifesting in another spark. Or let's put it this way, it's detaching into another spark, manifesting in a spark that is now Nivra, which means something God has created. In the parenthesis, he says, Yesh Leimer, like we call Ak, Adam Debriya. So even though Ak is a very, very high spiritual world, but since it's after the Tzimtzum, it's already called the domain of Bria, Adam de Bria, the structure of Bria. And what is this? So you have the spark of the divine Creator is manifest now in the small spark, which is called Nitzutz Echad Nivra, Shehi Neshama Daka, B'Ma'od Ma'od. This is a very, very subtle, very subtle and sublime state, and this is called Hanikra Yechida. This is called Yechida. So from the top down, Yechida Shebeneshama, the deepest level of the soul, is actually a spark that has within it the spark of the Creator. Now, why can't it just be the spark of the Creator? Because then it wouldn't be a separate entity. We want to have a neshama that can travel through the entire system, cosmic order, and come into a body. So you need to have something that is manifesting like a nivra. I don't want to call it a keli, a container. He doesn't call it a container. He just calls it the nitzutz. One that the first nitzutz is nitzutz that he calls nitzutz cotton. He's going to explain what levels they are soon. and then there's the nitzus nivra. Okay, and that's called yechida. And what about the other 4 levels of the soul? So then he says, "Benitzut zeh hanikri yechida." In this spark that's called yechida, the spark of from the creation's point of view, has sharshei dalet pchinas. It has within it the root of the 4 levels of chaya, neshama, ruach, and nefesh. And as the neshama evolves or travels downward, those levels begin to emerge. We, down below, work our way the other way around. We begin with nefesh, because that's what we relate to, biological life. We see our soul giving us life. And then we move to ruach, emotional life, and neshama, intellectual life, and chaya, transcendent life. And then we get to yechida. We say, Yom Kippur, we have yechida, ne'ilah, the 5th prayer, the 5th level. But every day we daven 3 prayers, we reach nefesh, ruach, neshama. Shabbos and Yom Tov, we have musaf, a 4th prayer, we reach chaya. And then once a year, achas, b'shana, achas, like nekuda achas, that's the connection, one. So one is a singularity, that's yechida. And that yechida is the spark with nivra, a created spark that comes from, that manifests the nitzutz echad boira, that's the b'chinas achreina, the lowest level of the creator. So the soul is, when we say in Tanya, chelik alekam emal mamish, though he doesnn't use this expression from Eitz Chaim, but in some of the commentaries explains this is essentially the process. The chelik alekam emal mamish, what's the chelik? What part is it? Chelik means like the lowest level from the creator that manifests in the spark of creation of yechida, which then in turn includes other levels of the soul as it comes downward. Okay. And this is where we stopped. So we're going to continue now reading, and this is all going to come back to explain neshama and Torah, how the interplay and the interaction between them. So here's what he says.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
You meant I just about the davening, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv. So the 3 davings. So Mariv is each one is proceedingly higher. Mariv is higher than Mincha V'Hulu. Is that the way it goes? I wasn't sure what you meant there.
Not necessarily. First of all, which Mariv are you talking about? The night before, the night after? If you're going from the night to the day, Mariv is the lowest level, then comes Shachris, then Mincha. It depends how you count it, but the generally
that makes more sense, yeah.
Excuse me?
That seems to make more sense when you start like that.
Yeah, but it doesn't always go in necessarily in the order, because Shachris would seem to be the highest level of all.
Mincha is, according to what I've learned, Mincha is the highest thing. It's considered very, very high, and the
Talmud says that a person should always be careful with Mincha. Mincha has a quality that the other 2 prayers don't have. But in general, Shachris has the bulk of the prayer and the longest prayer. The discussion, which one corresponds to which, is another discussion, not as black and white as it may seem. I don't know if it says explicitly which is which. And then again, whether you count Ma'ariv before or Ma'ariv after, I have to look into it a little more. In Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah is definitely the highest, and on Shabbos, Musaf would seem to be the highest, the Chaya, because that's the one that's added. But Musaf you daven before Mincha. So I'll look into. Let me see what I find. The concept is written shortly at the end of Likutei Torah, the end of Parsha Pinchas, is where the Alter Rebbe talks about it with Tzemach Tzedek's gloss about the 5 prayers corresponding to the 5 levels of the soul. But it's not relevant really to our discussion here. So I'll look it up. When I find it, I'll let you know what I find. Any other questions? So now continue on line 5 on page 1406. And the pages, if you want to follow along the text, can be found at ayinbeis.com. So it says like this. Visham He's quoting more from the Eitz Chaim. First, he quoted the exact language. So now we have the exact place where Yechida is, where it's rooted, and how Yechida encompasses the other levels of the soul. Bisham. And there in Eitz Chaim, he's quoting more from there. Shezel b'chinas atik v'arich. That these two levels, and I'll explain which is the two levels, is atik and arich. The arich, he b'chinas hakaylelas hakoil. Arich is the level that encompasses everything. So apparently that's the level of Yechida, as it is the root, the Nitzutz Yechida, that encompasses all the Dalet B'chinas, all the four levels, meaning the four worlds, or the four levels of the Neshama, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, and Neshama Chaya, Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. That's Arich. Va'atik zeo b'chinas tachteina shebemaitzil. And Atik is the tachteina shebemaitzil. In other words, the spark that's the lowest of the emanator, which apparently would mean the level of Nitzutz Boire. The first Nitzutz Kotem Moed, which is Achreina Shebeboire. I want to check it up in Eitz Chaim inside, just to make sure, but that seems to be how he's explaining it. So the two sparks that he mentions, the spark that is like the spark from the large flame of the Creator, manifesting in the spark, which is called Yechida, Nitzutzecha Nivra, the creation, would be Atik and Arich. That's what it looks like he's saying. Because it's hard to say that he means two levels in Yechida itself. So I don't think he means that, but it seems to be the way that's pshat. Okay. Okay, so now we have Atik and Arich. V'yadua. Now, I know the question has been asked, and before I read on, just want to emphasize, whenever you're speaking about these levels, Keser, Atik, Arich, Ak, there's a lot of interchangeable elements here. What I mean by that is that overall, you talk about after the Tzimtzum comes the Shimu, the Kav, Ak, Akudim, Nekudim, which is Toyu, and Vrudim, which is Tikkun Atzilus. Then Bri Yitzir Asiyah. That's the process. But remember, there's also a macrocosm. That's a microcosm. In macrocosm, Ak is called Bria de Klolis. Atzilus de Klolis is higher than Ak, usually the light before the Tzimtzum. Yitzira de Klolis is either Akudim and Nukudim, or sometimes called Atik and Arich, or, no, not called, rather, or Atik and Arich Keser of Atzilus, and Asiyah de Klolis in macrocosm would be Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiyah in microcosm. And there's some variations in that too. But on the other hand, sometimes we talk about Keser, even though Keser is the Keser of Atzilus, but if you don't go into the details, in general, everything higher than Atzilus could be called Keser. And then in the macrocosm level, you'll see now we're going to talk about that At Arich, the Arich, that Adam Kadmon is like an Arich Kloli of all Seder Shtalshlis. So it shouldn't confuse, because when you talk about Arich in microcosm, that's Keser of Atzilus. But here sometimes you talk Arich on a higher level, that would be Ak. And he's now going to explain that Ak has two levels, Chitzenius Ak and Primius Ak. And that corresponds to the Arich, to the two levels we're talking about here, how the Torah is a blueprint for existence, the Er Kloli. That's the outer dimension of Ak. And then there's the inner dimension of Ak, which was going to reflect more Atik. So that's how he explains it here. I recall also earlier, he brought from Torah Ed, the classic Torah Ed that is very often brought in Siddur. I just want to look it up a second. Or I may not find it right away. So if I don't find it, let's move on. Yeah, I wanted to refer to page 1393, but it's just going to be confusing. So let's not go there. So now he says like this. After we just explained Atik and Arich, these two levels, the Yadua, it's known, the Ak, Adam Kadman, who beginnes Arich, the Klolos, Ha'olamus. It's sometimes referred to as the Arich, which is like the lower level of Kesser of all the worlds. So we talked about Ak being the snapshot, the blueprint, the picture, all in one image. Like he said before, Skira Achas. You see all of time. Everything is encompassed in one snapshot. That is called Arich of Klolos, the Klolos elements. Shar Klolos elements. The Mishnah Chassidim from Rab Emmanuel Chai Reiki, a great Kabbalist, quoted very often in Chassidus. So he says, that's what he writes, that in the Shar, he has a Shar, a gate called Klolos elements, that Ach Adam Kadman is the Arich of Klolos elements. In other words, in a general sense, Arich of all the worlds. V'hainu. And what is the meaning of that? Liyes ak b'chinas era klali hakel hakel, like we said before. Being that Ak is the first world, the first dimension created after the Tzimtzum through the Kav, so it has a type of all-encompassing element, what we call before era klali, which encompasses everything. So zeh b'chinas arich. That's the level of arich, because what's arich? Arich we call is reish hanetzolim. Arich is a makif. It surrounds and is the head of all the emanations. That's in general Arich, in contrast to Atik, which is removed from that level. It's higher level. So that's why Ak, in a general sense, just like Arich of Atzilus, which means Arich of Keser of Atzilus, encompasses the entire Atzilus. The same thing, Arich of Bria, encompasses all of Bria. So too, in a global sense, Arich of Klolos elements of all the worlds is Ak. And now he's going back. Now remember, we said Kuchibrichu is Takel Baraisa. Hashem looks into the Torah and creates the world. What's Kuchibrichu? It means he's higher than Torah. He looks into Torah, and Torah he compared to this level of Ak, Chitzenius Ak, which is also Torah as a Klali, as a blueprint of existence. So now when we say, and he's referring to simply the lines he said on the previous page, this is 4 lines, 4 or 5 lines, 5 lines from the bottom of last page. Just reading from there, he's now referring back to that. The Kuchibrichu. On the level of Kuchibrichu, that's a stakel baraisa. Is B'chinas Primiusak, like we just said a little earlier. Zeu B'chinas Atik. That's the level of Atik. So essentially, Atik is looking into Arich, and with that he creates the world. Because like we spoke about, what is the necessity of this? God could have created the world in a split second without doing anything. He doesn't have to look into any blueprint, but he wanted it to make sense. He wanted us to have stepping stones. He wanted us to have an interface which to connect. So if it would be Kuchibrichu on its own, completely removed, there's no relationship. So Kuchibrichu is a level Atik that's removed. That level then in turn connects through the blueprint that he wrote, the Torah, and with that he creates existence. So when we come from the bottom up and look at existence, we have something to follow. We look into the same blueprint, and through that we connect to Kuchibrichu. That's higher than the blueprint. So in other words, the architect is God. The blueprint is the Torah that he uses, to which manifests his wisdom, his will, and he uses as a blueprint to which to create existence. And neshamas that come into existence look into the Torah, and that's how they connect to the architect. So we have Chetzenius Ak would be here Arich, and Primius Ak would be Kuchibrichu, the level of Atik. We still have to connect it to the soul. Because remember, he's brought the Eitz Chaim, that the soul, Yechida, is a bridge, because the yechida of the neshama is the nitzutz nivra, which manifests within it the nitzutz beira. Basically, it's like arich manifesting atik. So now he's going to explain that. Okay. And Torah, which is the level of the kloli, like ak, a all-encompassing energy and light, that's the outer dimension of ak. What about neshamas? The neshama, but the level of the nitzutz of the soul. That's higher than yechida. Because we said before, the nitzutz of the soul is rooted in the nitzutz of the Beira, of the Creator. Shehi b'chinas arich. So this can be a little confusing, because which is the level of arich? The soul? Or the level, it can't be referring to the higher level. So let me read on and I'll explain. So just be patient. So he says, Al b'chinas hanitzutz the neshama shalamayla b'chinas yechida. Shehi b'chinas arich. Because we said before yechida is arich, because arich encompasses all the four lower levels. Like we just read in Eitz Chaim, so the spark of the soul that is coming from the spark of the Beira, that it comes from the Tachtena Shebebeira, that's higher than Teira. Because Teira is the level of Arich. The Neshama, as it manifests in Yechida, is also the level of Arich. But the root of the Neshama, which is Tachtena Shebebeira, is like compared to Atik. So that's higher than Teira. V'hainu. Or let me stop for a moment. So that's where you have it. So in other words, if you're talking about the Neshama as it comes down lower, even Yechida would be like the level of Teira. Nefesh Chaya, Nefesh Ruach, Neshama is definitely lower, like we learned earlier. And that's why it looks to the Teira for guidance. But the etzem of the Neshama, Yechida, is rooted, like he said, it manifests the koyach nitzutz beira, tachtena shebebeira, that's like atik, and that's higher than Torah. So there you have actually, what shall I say, the dynamics, the anatomical dynamics, the anatomy of how it works and where everything is placed. Now, of course, you could ask the question: isn't Torah rooted also in higher places? We say Torah is v'eya etzlei amen. Shashuyim lefonov. So we'll discuss that. Let's not go there right now. Now we're talking about Torah as it's serving as a blueprint for creation. Istaka baraisa, which we're comparing to the level of Chetzenius Adam Kadman Ak. Neshamis go down lower, but they're rooted in Yechida, which is rooted in the Tachtena Shebe Beira, or like Tachtena Shebe Maitzil Atik. And from that perspective, Atik is higher than Torah, which is like Arich, Ak, Chetzenius of Ak. In simple English, it means that the Torah, Chetzenius Ak, in some way, even though they're higher than existence, we learned that Torah is Kodma La'olam. And indeed, God looks at it as a blueprint with which he creates existence. But still, it has some relationship because the blueprint of existence. So it has some type of relationship on this level of Torah. The Neshamas, on the other hand, are coming from the highest levels of the divine, in this case, what he calls Tachtena Shebebeira, which is a very small spark, which in turn manifests in the spark of Yechida, Arich, which in turn encompasses all the lower levels of the four levels of the soul beneath it, which correspond to the four worlds. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, it's this the neshama, the highest level of neshama, the is you said is rooted in Atik. No, didn't you say that? Or here, whereas doesn't it say here, Shalamayla, Aval Bechinas and Nitzus the neshama, Shalamayla, Bechinas Yechida, Shehi Bechinas Arich. Arich. Does it say there it's Arich, this highest level of neshama, not Yechida?
Well, read a few lines before.
Atik.
Well, look at line 5, where after he explains that there are two, remember the discussion about the two levels of spark,
Yeah,
two sparks?
right. Yeah, the spark of the Bora and the Nivra.
Okay, so there he says, for Sham, that this is Atik and Arich. Yechida is Arich. The spark of the Bora, which manifests in Yechida, is Atik. That's what he's referring to here. That b'chinas nitzutz and neshama shalamayla b'chinas Yechida, which means lamayla from Arich. The nitzutz of the soul, as it's manifesting the nitzutz of the Bora. Not talking about how it's Yechida, we're talking about where it's rooted. In the nitzutz, in the spark of the Bora, that's Atik. Yechida is indeed Arich.
So it would seem like that Yechida Shehi Bechidas Arich is referring to Yechida, no?
Yeah, but the Yechida manifests the level of Atik, which is the nitzutz Bora that's higher than Arich and Yechida.
Right. Okay. But no, I thought you were reading that the Shehi Bechidas Arich was going on the level of the neshama rather than here Yechida.
No, the level of Yechida,
Torah, which is Torah.
I'm not sure. I mean,
sure
are you hearing
Torah,
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's two sparks here. There's the spark of the creator. There's the spark of the creation. The spark of the creation is called Yechida. That's Arich. In it manifests the spark of the Bora, which is Atik.
Right.
Bora is like Arich, like Yechida.
Right.
And the neshama is rooted in the spark of the creator, which is Atik.
Right. That's what I thought. Okay.
Okay. We're going in circles here. I mean,
no,
either you're not hearing me.
No, I got it right. I thought when I got it, I understand now what I was saying, but I thought you were alluding to that last line that Hakol Shazeh Bechidas Arich was going on in the Neshama rather than the Atik.
Where do you see Neshama? It says it's Yechida. There's no word Neshama there. He's not even talking about Nefesh Ruach Neshama here. He's talking about Yechida. The word Neshama here is not the level of Neshama. This Nitzutz Neshama means the soul of the Nitzutz of the soul in general. He's not referring to Neshama here as a level. He calls it Neshama Daka b'ma'id ma'id hanikr Yechida. Okay? Got it?
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any other questions? So now he continues. V'hainu shatei b'chinas eisen chaytim peda'ak. The Rebbe Rashab is now introducing another of the Kabbalistic levels. So I'll explain in a moment, just bear with it. So an ak, eisen chaytim pe of ak, is, remember, the human being was created in the divine image. So just as we have ears, nose, and a mouth, so that's rooted in eisen chaytim pe of Adam Kadman. That's considered, like he says, that's like chitzenius ak, because it's already how ak is manifesting in the cavities of hearing, smell, and mouth speaking. I mean, it's not actually hearing and smelling and speaking there, but it's the levels that are channels. So it's chitzenius ak, as they're already channels or cavities. Like we see the ear, the nose, and the mouth are all cavities that connect the outer and to the inner. They have their channels of expression. So in ak, they're already channels of expression. V'neshama same b'chinas atzmus ak. Atzmus is higher than eisen chaytim peh. It's the very core before it's being channeled through these cavities. We learned about this at length closer to the end of volume 1. So it's just another way of explaining chitzenius ak and pnimius ak, Torah and neshamas. Okay, so he's basically placed where the neshamas are higher, like Atik compared the root of the neshama, higher than Torah, which is the kloli, like chitzenius ak. So in the process of creation, you have kutshe brichu, pnimius ak, looks into Torah, chitzenius ak, and with that blueprint creates the world. But then you have neshamas, barnash, When they look into the Torah, we're talking about the neshama of Atik drawing from Kutchebrichu, Elokus, into the Torah. So it's not the Torah creating the world, that's going downward. Now the neshamas have the ability to bring what he called Atzmis Eid himself, that's higher than Torah, into Torah. That's what the neshamas do down below. That's so far what we've learned. But now he's going to go further into Torah itself. We know Torah also has levels. That's what he's going to address now. V'hinei, and now, b'Torah yesh b'chinas primis v'chitzenis. In Torah, there's an inner dimension of Torah, there's an outer dimension of Torah. V'zeh, the istaka b'araisa, when we say that God looked into the Torah, that's referring to chitzenius HaTorah. Zeu chitzenius HaTorah. That's the outer Torah. That's the Torah as it serves as a blueprint for creation. But that's not the essence of Torah. Aval primius HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, is a far higher level than that. It's not just a blueprint for creation. Hu inyan ve'eya etzle shashuyim. And the Torah was by him delights. Shashuyim is like a delight. Shashu is like a toy that you play with. But on the highest level, we call it the divine delights. Shashuyim, in other words, it's God's, it's like the king, what internally, when he's not with anyone else, what entertains him, so to speak. I don't want to use the word entertain, it's not a good word. What is his delight? His delicacy, so to speak. Shashuyim. That's primis HaTorah, that's Shashuyim. So it's not the Torah as it serves as a blueprint for creation. Torah is something that God and Torah are like one. When you say it, that's why when David HaMelech, and we learned this at length in volume 1, I referred to it on Friday, previous class, long discussion about this. Basically, if you want to look it up on page, and it starts with chapters 162 and on. Literally, a lot of what we're learning here is connected to there. I'm still learning it over, reviewing it there, so I'll be coming back with it. But he discusses all these ideas back then, and definitely has a connection. So we know that David HaMelech was punished. It says, David's miras hayli chukecha, he said. Your laws, your chukim of Torah, zmiras hayli. They were like song to me. So it says that God says, the Gemara tells us, zmiras karisalahu, you call them song? In other words, the whole Torah, you're quantifying something to delight, to serve as your pleasure, your songs. The Torah is God's delights, shashuyim lefonov. And as a result, David was punished in the story in Tanakh that he forgot about carrying the Aron, had to be carried face to face, and he forgot that mitzvah. So Chassidus explains, why did he forget that mitzvah? Because he forgot the pnimius of Torah. He only talked about chesenius of Torah as it's a song for us, like a blueprint for us. But he forgot the pnimius of Torah. That's why he forgot the mitzvahs that when they walked with the Aron, they had to face each other, panim el panim, because it's all about pnimius. So he forgot the pnimius. But regardless, getting back to our topic here, pnimius of Torah is sheshuyim lefanov. That's a very different dimension in Torah. That's Torah as it's God's expression, not just how he creates. In other words, the architect creating the structure, the universe, is a blueprint. That's the chitzenius of Torah. Primis of Torah is higher than being a blueprint and higher than being an klali. So primis ak. So now we see Torah is also the level of primis ak. K'moy hatainug shu primis harotzen. Shashoyim is pleasure, tainug. Shashua, which is the primis of rotzen. The outer dimension of pleasure is the desire of the king, which is that he wants to create a world. And that's like the chitzenius of Torah. But there's a primis, the tainug within that is God's pleasure that he has in Torah, and that's primis ak. So So then, how's that consistent with what we just said? Neshamas, he said, are higher than Torah. That's higher than Chetzenius Torah. But what about Primus Torah? Umakol Mokim, says the Rebbe Rashab, but nevertheless, Haneshamas hein lamaila, Miklolas Torah, gam b'chinas haprimius. Neshamas are yet still higher than in general, close from Torah in general, including its inner dimension. The question is, how do you explain that? Because based on this, it would seem, yes, there's an outer dimension of Torah, but there's also an outer dimension of souls, which are lower than Torah, and Torah is higher. The inner dimension of Torah seems to be the same level as the Neshamas, Pnimius Ak, which would be like the level of Atik, pleasure. So he's going to explain it with another Eitz Chaim, the famous Eitz Chaim that we already learned a number of times. And he's going to say like this, V'yesh lemer. And we can say, Shari, be'Eitz Chaim, Shar Shviras HaKelim Perek Hey. So in Eitz Chaim, in another place, in the Shar Shviras HaKelim, chapter 5. Now you may remember this was brought earlier, and they actually corrected it in a footnote below. Let me just refer you to it. I think it's on, where was it? Yeah, on page 1397. There, they corrected in the text. It said Eitz Chaim Shar HaMalachim. So below they said the Ulay Tzorech Li Shviras Shar Shviras HaKelim Perek Hey. Here the Rebbe Rashab clearly says that it's a Shar Shviras HaKelim Perek Hey. What does he say? Isa, he says there, Sheyesh Kedugmis Atik LeElam Golgalta Da'ak. So just like there's an Atik in Keser, higher than Atzilus, Atik and Arach, that's the main place of Keser. So the Eitz Chaim says that there's Ke'en Kedugmas. There's something similar to Atik that's above Le'ela, above the Golgalta, the skull of Adam Kadmon. So Adam Kadmon also has a Keser. And there's an Atik that's similar to what we say about Atik of the Keser of Atzilus. We say Kedugmas Le'ela Golgalta Da'ak. So now we have Chitzenius Avak, Panimius Avak, and we have this Atik that's above the skull of Ak. Now the skull is usually Arich, just for the record. Here I don't know how he's going to explain it. We'll see in a moment. V'im Kain, says the Rebbe Rashab. And based on that, if that's the case, Hanashama Hainu Anitzit Shu B'chinas Atik, the soul, which is the nitzitz, which is the level of Atik, like we said. Tachteina Shebebeda, the higher level, Yesh Leimer Shezeu B'chinas Atik Da'ak. This is from Atik of Ak. And that's higher than Primus Ateda. Shebchinas Primus Ak. So it's true, it's the Primus of Adam Kadmon, but it's not the Atik of Ak. Atik of Ak is even higher than Primus. Called it the Etzem. Well, he called before Primus Ak also Atzmis of Ak. But clearly Atik is even higher. When you say Primus of Atzilus, for example, or the Primus of a human being, let's just use that example. The Primus of a person is obviously higher than the external, our external expression, but the Atik of the person is even higher than Primus because it's beyond, it's above the head, in other words, beyond even the inner dimension of the faculties of a person. So he doesn't explain what this means in Aveda, or even what level it is. He's just telling us that's the level. So there you have Chitzenius Ateda is Chitzenius of Ak. Primus Ateda is Primus of Ak. Initially explained that that's where the Neshamas are. But now that Ateda is Primus Ak, he's saying the Neshamas, however, are even higher than that. They come from Atik of Ak. And he is going to explain it in the next section. But now he just established the location, so to speak. Explanation is coming now. We're going to learn it. But in case anybody wants me to clarify anything, I'll stop for a moment. So the Inyan is in this, the Hariyatera, Hibchines Chochma. Torah is the level of Chochma. And when he means the level of Chochma, he means Torah as it manifests. Because we just said Torah is Tainuk, Shashuyim. But Torah in general, the way it manifests is in a body of wisdom. Torah is a Chochma. It's not like mitzvahs. Mitzvahs is not Chochma. Mitzvahs is Ratzon. It's God's will. Keep Shabbos, put on film, tzitzis, whatever it may be. Torah is the wisdom of God and with a logic in it, with a understanding. It's rooted in places that are higher than Chochma, which we'll learn about. But Torah, as it manifests, we call it Chochma. And even in Keser, mitzvahs will be compared to Golgalta, the skull, and Torah will be compared to Chochma Stimah, to the superconscious intelligence. Because Torah is at the end of the day rooted in some form of Chochma. And now, like, for example, when you talk about in a human being, in the human soul, Chochma is one of the faculties of the soul. It's the first of the 10 faculties. It's not the soul itself. Chochma, even though it's superior and it's a reshis, is the beginning of consciousness, a spark, even if it's a high level of bittul, kayachma, but it's still a faculty. You can't call it the soul itself. The nefesh itself doesn't have is beyond faculties. The nefesh includes faculties, but like in Tanya, Ayin Beis, he talks about the neshama chelika lekam memal mamish nefesh alikis in chapter 2. In chapter 3, he starts saying, now this nefesh alikis has 10 faculties, which evolve nishtalshlu mehen from the 10 spheres. But the soul itself is not defined by these faculties. The faculty is not the sum of the parts. The soul is an energy, a seamless energy, which encompasses 10. Just like God, even though he has attributes, Chochma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, you can't say God is defined by his attributes. Those are expressions of him. So the same thing in the nefesh. Chochma, at the end of the day, is a faculty, not the nefesh itself. The Gam commission is barely ill. And this includes even what we spoke about earlier. Sha'chochma be'etzem ubchinas tainug, in volume 1 was at length. I think he made reference to this also in volume 3, I think in volume 2 as well. That Chochma is tainug. So we learned that even though Chochma is wisdom, but really it's essentially divine pleasure that manifests in intelligence. That's why when we understand something, we have a certain inner satisfaction and pleasure. And that's why we say, I don't know if he's going to bring it here, Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik. We'll see. But meanwhile, nevertheless, you have to say, you could say, it's like an answer, that even though it manifests Tainug, but it's still Tainug as it manifests in Chochma. In other words, it's not pure, undiluted pleasure. Like when you have pleasure with wisdom, it's a pleasure that's associated with wisdom. It's ultimately manifests through intelligence. There's other forms of pleasure that have nothing to do with Chochma. So what do you see? That it's not Tainug etzem. It's not etzem tainug. It's Tainug as it manifests in Chochma. Or the language he uses, Tainug bebchinas Chochma. The Tainug within the level of Chochma. Now the Rebbe Rashab goes even more subtly into it. What does that mean? Ube'emes, in truth, once you reach that level of pleasure, you can't really identify it. You can't say in truth that there's a level of Chochma. So why are you saying that it's like Tainug connected to Chochma? Makol Mokim, that is a Tainug be'eza dover she'ena dover mamish. I'm not sure how he translates. Yiddish, he translates this. As a Tainug be'eza dover. Okay. I'll translate it and then I'll read the Yiddish. So nevertheless, even though Chochma has somewhat melted away, and let me explain. When you understand something well, so there's two stages. The first stage is your mind is understanding it. So it's definitely an intellectual process. And you get through different questions you may have, and doubts and confusion. But there's a point where you get to where you say, I got it. I understand. So then the intelligence, so to speak, gets absorbed and dissolved into a deep pleasure of understanding something well. And when you're in that state of pleasure, the Chochma is no longer significant because it's not about the understanding. It's the result of it that resonates with you, this deeper truth that you've discovered. Obviously, it came through the process of intelligence, an intellectual, cognitive effort that you invested in it. But there comes a point where you are just basking in the joy and the pleasure of getting something on a deeper level. Obviously, when you talk about godliness, you're basking in the divine, in the delight of the divine experience you just had. So it's become more of a pleasurable experience than what we'd call an intellectual experience. So he's saying, initially he says, that still, since it's Chochma, so it's a Tainuk Sheba Chochma. But in truth, he says, no, it's not really. Because Chochma is no longer manifesting. That's what he says. It's not a level of intelligence now anymore. It's now become a level of pleasure. But Makom Mokim, he says, it's still a pleasure in something. It's not a pleasure that's completely amorphous or completely shapeless or seamless. It's a pleasure be'ezeh dover, and whatever it is that you were trying to understand. She'eina dover mamish. It's not an identity anymore because it's no longer the particular concept, but to say that is completely devoid, completely divorced, completely disconnected from whatever it is that you were understanding, you can't say either. Because at the end of the day, you're experiencing that higher, that the delight, the pleasure of a higher reality in that you just understood. That's what he adds in the parentheses. A geschmack in epis vos. You have a geschmack. Let's say you're learning about Eir Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, and it's very complicated. Then you finally come to get it somewhat. You get it. So you have a deep satisfaction that permeates you. So it's true, the satisfaction or the pleasure is not, you can't call it Chochma any longer because it's reached a higher level than Chochma, but you can't say it's completely disconnected. That's why it says, Epis vos. You're having a geschmack in that. Yes, the focus is now on the geschmack, on the pleasure, but it's still a pleasure in something that you discovered. So it's not pure and pristine as if a pleasure which has no relationship at all, was not derived through any Chochma. That's what it seems to me that he's saying. And you see from the next line, Lo yatainug ba'atzmus levad. It's not the tainug in the atzmus, the core of itself. She'ena b'shum dover klal rak ba'atzmus. Then there's nothing else connected to it. There's no Chochma. There's nothing that. There you're having pleasure just in the core of it, like it says elsewhere. So we need to find good explanation for this and good examples. I would say, like in this case, it's like three stages really, or three, I want to say stages, three different experiences. Chochma is understanding. The pleasure that comes from Chochma is a pleasure in that which you understood, and that something there. A pleasure in the Atzmus is like having pleasure in God himself. That has nothing to do at all with any Chochma, with anything. It's like completely being dissolved in the higher presence of something beyond you. Whereas where the level of Tainug and Chochma, even though Chochma is like, so to speak, the Chochma, the cause of this pleasure, has somewhat dissolved, but it's still a Tainug that is connected to that Eza Dover that he calls, Epis vos, something there. So this is a pretty deep and subtle topic, but that's what he's explaining. The difference between Torah is ultimately explained and the Neshamas. So let's see what he's explaining, and then we'll come back and try to discuss this more. Let's just get out the idea, and then, as I said, definitely can use more elaboration. And so too, you can explain, you can say, b'teira gam b'teira in teira, gam k'moy yeshlem b'teira, gam k'moy ve'eya etzle shashuyim. Even the way the teira is eya etzle shashuyim, we're not talking about the teira as a blueprint. We're not talking about chitzenius hateira, primus hateira. That's shashuyim. It's God's delights. B'chinas shashuyim ha'atzmim. And more than that, it's not just delights; it's core delights. In other words, it's not. It's really very touches. It's connected to God in a very profound way. It's still the tainuk b'teira, rather. That's still a pleasure in teira. It's manifesting in something called teira. Aval neshamas, but souls, heim b'chinas tainuga atzmi mamish. Souls are tainuga atzmi mamish. It's the entity itself. It's not an experience of something, like in this case, teira is the entity itself. So here I would give the explanation. The truth is, he said this earlier on page 1252. I say I marked for myself. 1252, the Rebbe Rashab explained it. Literally the same idea. I want to go back there and read it, but before I do, let me just explain. And this is based a lot on what it says in Tanya. Because here comes the question. In chapter 2 in Tanya, he compares the neshamas to children, to a son. A father and son are intrinsically connected. It comes from etzem moechav. We're a piece of our father. Chelik elekam emal mamish. And as he said, because God's Chochma is one with him. So then, question is, why do you need Torah? We're already a son of God. If you're a child of God, why do you need anything else? Because you need to reveal it. You could have a child, that's part of you, but the child is not necessarily aligned with you. We can see children, for example, actually sometimes behave very different than what their father wants them to do. Torah is God's wisdom, is God's plan, is God's delights. So Torah, together with the neshama, so to speak, helps the child connect and reveal its intrinsic connection to its father. But Torah, at the end of the day, is not called Banim Atem Lashem Alekech. You don't say the Torah is a child of God. And indeed, it's the neshama that comes down to earth to make a dira b'tachtenim. The Torah directs us how to do so. So the Torah is like a partner with us. But it would be the equivalent of a king sending his son, his child, to rule in a distant land. And he gives him a book, a guidebook, how to rule according to the king's plan. So as much as the Torah is God's delights, it still manifests in this book, in this Torah. Whereas the child is a piece of God himself. It's his son. It's a piece of him. However you explain a piece of. That's why he brought the Eitz Chaim, that the Nechida is rooted in the Nitzutz Echad of the Tarteinu Shebebeira. So in truth it says both Torah and Eden Yisrael, Kodmala, Bereshis Bara, Bereshis B'Shvil Yisrael, B'Shvil HaTorah, they both Kodmala Elam, like we learned before. They both precede existence. They're both higher than creation. And then he says, the Tana Tvel, we don't know which is higher than which till we see that it says in the Torah, Savas B'nai Yisrael. So we know from that the Torah was given for the Yisrael, not the other way around. And indeed, the concept of Pekuach Nefesh, to save a soul, is Deichel Kol HaTorah Kula. If a Torah was higher than a soul, then why would you push aside the Torah to save a soul? So you have to say the soul is higher. What means that it's higher? Torah is mamish God's Torah. It's not some external thing, God forbid. So he's explaining that there's the tainug in Eza Davar, not the Atzmi itself, like he says. Shashim Atzmi, tainug b'Torah, and the Neshamas is tainug Atzmi mamish. It's the father himself enjoying his son. Is different than the father enjoying his wisdom, so to speak, or his plan. even though there's shashuyim there. But to understand this, I would suggest we go back and read page 1252. I will just read, let me just see here. There's more explanation here, but I would read 1252 before we read on this next parentheses. So if you don't mind, let's go back to 1252 for a moment. And there he says like this, Aleph Reish Nun Beis. So the Rebbe Rashab says, so he's talking there that the neshamas are rooted higher than Torah. Same idea that he speaks about here. Even calls it atik compared to arich and so on. In the new paragraph, he asks if neshamas are, you're saying neshamas are higher than Torah, and though Torah and Hashem are one, and God are one, that's in Giluyim from Atzmus. The Torah is one with God. The Giluyim. There's a virtue of Torah over souls. The Torah, the Torah is one with God because the Torah never becomes something separate. The neshamas are like a child. Yes, they come from the etzem, they come from the etzem, but a child separates. A child is not like a limb of the father. Torah is like a limb of the father. But the way it is in the core level, because they're rooted mamish in the etzem, in the core. I'm going to skip the parentheses, but actually I shouldn't skip the parentheses. It's relevant. So then he says, look in the Kut Torah. I'm just going quickly through that page. That even the source of pleasures is only imcha. It's not atzmus muhus. Ki imcha, it's with you. It's one with God, but it's not mamish the core itself. And this is where he says this word. Even though he says that atzmus, which is mitzusim atzmuse, meaning an existence that comes from within himself, you only say that at an atzmus. Yeshleimer shezeh b'chinas shashim ha'atzmin detera u'b'chinas tainug ha'atzmi mamish ha'misham sheirish ha'neshamis. Okay, so mokra tainugim is a shashim atzmi of Torah. Ubchinas tainug ha'atzmi mamish, but tainug ha'atzmi mamish is even higher. Shemishamu sheirish ha'neshamis. And then he goes on to say that that's the level, the highest possible level. In other words, it's one with Atzmos itself, and Torah is one, I don't want to say step below that, because it's still connected and one, but it's still in the way God manifests as like a limb, an expression in some way, ultimately. And then he goes on to say there that a v'raya muchachas al zeh, an absolute proof that this is the case is from tshuva. He goes on to prove, because tshuva, if someone transgresses against the Torah, if the Torah was the highest thing, that's it. The fact that we can do tshuva is proof that there's something higher than Torah, because you can, God forbid, transgress the Torah and still be able to do tshuva and return. So right, that neshamas are higher than Torah, because they're touching the etzem that's higher than gilui. And this goes back to the topic of Einoid, that the distress and the darkness of a Baal Tshuva reaches the Etzem more than a Tzaddik. Similar idea, because a Tzaddik is higher in Giluyim, and it's a very high level. But there's something that happens when you're able to go to a place where you're, so to speak, on the Giluyim level, a person wandered away from Torah and still connect. That is because you're reaching a level that's higher than even the Gilui of Torah. So though Torah is rooted in the highest level, like he's calling it the Tainug, he's calling it, like he said here, a Tainug B'Teira, and then there's Tainug Atzmi Mamish. So, in a sense, using the example of a father and a child, the child, let's say, wanders away from what the father wanted him to be. But the connection is always there. And therefore, in a healthy situation, even though the child is doing against, is defying, and he's going against what his father wants him to do, which is the Torah, yet, because the connection is so fundamental, the father can forgive him and allows him to return. Why? If the Torah is so essentially one with the father, because the son is more. At the end of the day, the Torah was given for the son, not the son was given for the Torah. So though Torah is still inextricably bound with God, like he said, it's one, but it's still ultimately, as it manifests in God's so-called plan, what God wants, the Gilui, yes, it's one with him, it's dafka these mitzvahs, not others, it's not arbitrary at all. But still there's one thing higher, the children themselves, the child itself. And that's the etzem, what he says, that the tainug atzmi, in the thing itself, the tainug between father and child, which is even higher than father and Torah, or the Hashem and Torah. That's what he said. The parenthesis is going to explain this further. But I'm going to stop here for any questions. And that's why we say that's Atik of Adam Kadmon. It's higher than Pnimius of Adam Kadmon, which is Pnimius HaTorah. Definitely higher than Chitzenius Adam Kadmon, Chitzenius HaTorah.
Yeah, Rabbi.
I mean, the closest example, one second. I often share the sikha that the Rebbe gave in Simchas Torah, Tavshem Mem Zayin. It comes to mind when Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbe was crying about it, very emotional sikha, where he spoke about when Moshe shatters the luchos, the tablets, in order to save the Jewish people after they built the golden calf. And he does not take no for an answer. He argues and challenges God, and he ultimately prevails. Salachti kidvarecha. Now remember, the Jews very deliberately broke the second commandment. They've created a false god. They created an idol. It's yareg va'yaver. It's actually from the mitzvahs that pekuach nefesh does not. You better allow yourself to die before you worship an idol. So even there, it's so, because why? Because it's so fundamental in the connection between a human being and God. So it's from the three things that pekuach nefesh does not. There you have to give your life. And yet, Moshe gave his life and said, erase my name from the Torah. He broke the tablets to save the Jewish people. And essentially, it came down to that love that Moshe had for the people. And he was saying that you and God and the people, you all love each other. And that love is even more powerful than Avodah Zarah, than a Yareg V'Yaver, than the golden calf. And he prevailed. And God revealed the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim. We learned earlier, Nikrus Atzur, God revealed the secrets, the Helam HaAtzmi. That demonstrates that an neshama is higher than Torah. Because at the end of the day, Moshe was ready he shattered the Torah. He shattered the tablets that God himself had written and crafted and carved. He was ready to say, erase my name from the Torah. I mean, it doesn't get stronger than that. That means he's ready to compromise, disassociate from Torah, God's Torah, Torah's Chaim. Because there's one thing higher than the neshamas. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean we can get away with anything we want to do. The point was that Moshe said they will do tshuva. That's why Yom Kippur, we do tshuva. It's not just, oh, great, we're forgiven and we go party. It's a serious day. But it shows that at the end of the day, the connection between the neshama and Hashem is so deep that nothing can actually sever it. But sometimes you have to work very hard to regain the trust. Because remember, the end of the day, it's also Giluyim. That's why we have Torah mitzvahs. We want this connection to be revealed. You could then say, In Golus, we also have this essential connection, yet we want Mashiach. We want it revealed. We want to see godliness. We don't just want eyes that live in the dark and need the Torah to guide us. We want our eyes to see God himself. And for that, it requires the Torah and everything that comes with it to reveal it all. So the Torah is an atzmi, obviously. It's not just as I said, arbitrary or secondary thing. Well, but when you really push comes to shove, it's the neshamas that are ultimately the highest level. But still, like we learned here, they'll only get there when they first recognize the Torah is higher than they are on this earth. And then we climb and we study Torah and we learn Torah. And even what we're discussing now, we know from Torah. How do we know that the neshamas are higher than Torah? That also is revealed to us from Torah. We're learning it in my Maimer here. Ichsidis, Tshuva, in Tanit Ve'elyo, and all the different sources are also Torah sources for this. So Torah even reveals that which is beyond Torah. But the point being is that this is why neshamas ultimately have the power to be mamshech something. It's like the child can give something to the Torah that the Torah in a way doesn't have on its own because it gives it the etzem connection it has with the father. So when the father and child reconnect and the Torah also is enriched by it. And that's why Moshe broke the tablets, because ultimately Hashem said, Yesher koichech asher shabata, thank you for breaking them, because it really revealed a deeper level in the neshamas for sure, but also in Torah ultimately. That's one way of explaining some of what we're learning here. Again, as I said, I'll stop for any other questions if you want to ask. Yeah. Any questions?
I think that last point is so powerful about ultimately, you could argue that tshuva itself is part of Torah. So maybe tshuva is higher, but Torah is higher because it's still the tshuva, which says, even if you break my rules, you can come back to me. That's rooted in Torah, the ability to tshuva. But this last part where you brought in that even the one mitzvah that God says, even Torah says you can't. Torah is higher. I mean, because you can't do avodah zarah. There, ultimately, even if when we did that, Moshe said what he said, that I'm going to transgress the highest level of tshuva, so of an avera so high that Torah itself says you have to die for it. That God and Moshe says no. Ultimately, I don't care. So to speak. The Yidden itself are higher than that level, and God was masking. I think it's an incredible. I know you said that before, but it just struck me as the most powerful proof of the whole discussion here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Point well taken. Yeah, it's correct because you could say ultimately Torah. There's two levels in Torah: Torah without tshuva and Torah with tshuva. Correct, but there's no question yet. Ultimately, the bottom line is in a sicha in Sovei Pasha Kisovei Tavshinun Beis, the Rebbe says something very interesting that adds to this. He says like this: why is it that Pekuach Nefesh Deicha Kol HaTorah? Because like the Chazal say, desecrate one Shabbos in order to be able to keep many Shabbos. In other words, if a person, let's say for argument's sake, say Torah was higher than the Neshamas, will the Torah bring you to the Neshama, or will the Neshama ultimately bring you to Torah? You see, that's the vart also. Since neshamas are higher than Torah, it's not that you're ultimately desecrating Torah. Right now you're desecrating, you're going against it. But ultimately, because neshamas are one with God, they will bring you to Torah. The Torah will follow. Whereas if you went the other way around, not necessarily. Someone keeps Torah and you forgo, let's say you said, you know what, let's forget about the neshama. Not necessarily the Torah will bring that neshama back. He says something like that there in Kisove. So in other words, at the end of the day, the neshamas are higher, but they will ultimately, since Torah is one with God, the neshama will ultimately bring Torah back. In other words, that's why we say lo yidach memenu nidach, that ultimately the neshama will do tshuva. But it's not the condition, it's just because the neshama is that higher level.
I'm sure you've told us many times where that sikha is, that one about Moshe breaking and says, and the Rebbe cried. You said it was. He said it's
Torah, Tov Mem Zayin, yeah.
Mem Zayin. Thank you.
It's a very powerful sikha. It later was edited by the Rebbe and printed, but there it's much more technical. If you really want to get the power of it, you have to read the sikha in Yiddish, the way it was delivered than Simchas Torah. It's a very powerful sikha. The question is whether I think we should stop here because the parentheses is going to explain this, but the parentheses itself needs plenty of explanation. I think we have a lot here to absorb as it is. So I would vote to just stop here and then continue tomorrow. What needs to be really discussed and understood is what Torah does for neshamas and what neshamas do for Torah. The mere fact to say that neshamas are higher than Torah, okay, that I think is pretty understandable. I mean, you have to still dig deeper and understand it well. But the question is then, on one hand, the Torah reveals the connection of the neshamas to Hashem when we learn Torah, but we're going to learn as well that the neshamas reveal the power of Torah as well. When we learn Torah, we make the Torah come alive. Remember, what would the Torah be in this earth without souls, without people? It would just be a book. It would just be words. So to really make them come alive, you need someone who's learning and living by the Torah. But at the same time, the Torah is like the guide. I mean, it's all going to go back to the concept of the eyes, that the eyes need the light to be able to see, but the ones that really see are the eyes, not the light. It's the eyes that see, but they need the light to see, and ultimately the eyes will become, the eyes will be able to see on their own, because the etzem koyach hariyah is all the way connected. That's ultimately what he's going to come back to say in the context of the eyes. So it's a very back and forth. As far as the interface goes, Yisrael, Shamas come down below, they're separate. Torah reveals in them, gives them guidance. In turn, the Shamas illuminate the Torah. Okay, very interesting how that works. At the end of the day, you need Yisrael, Araisa, and Kudsha Brichu. It's just different ways that the connections are made. Earlier stages. Okay, we'll discuss it all more I'm just thinking out loud. That's all I'm really doing. Any other questions or comments? I'm going to stop here before the parentheses here, closer to the end of the paragraph on 1406. I see there's plenty to go here. Okay. Okay, so we'll stop here.